Story 1. My name is Thomas Everett, and for the past 26 years, I've been the night caretaker at Rose Hill Cemetery, a patch of land that most people in town forget exists until they have to. It's not a big place, about 5 acres of weather-worn headstones and leaning statues, with a chapel nobody uses and an iron bell that used to toll in a different lifetime. I've swept the same paths for decades, kept the weeds from overtaking the graves, changed out dead flowers for plastic ones families leave behind. Night is usually nothing but the hum of crickets and the occasional fox brushing past the gate. But on a Tuesday in early October, everything changed. I remember because the air had that bite that means fall is finally serious. And I had just made tea when I heard it. The bell. One single, low chime. Loud enough to wake every nerve in my body. I froze in my chair, the mug trembling in my hand. My first thought was that I had imagined it. The tower bell hadn't rung since 1973, not since they decommissioned the old manual rope system and declared the funeral traditions outdated. But then it rang again. Not in the air this time, but somewhere inside my ribs. I glanced at the clock. 3:17 a.m. exactly. I threw on my coat and grabbed the flashlight, my boots crunching on gravel as I crossed the main path. The air outside was still. No wind, no sounds, as if the night itself were listening. The bell stood at the northern edge of the grounds, just above the old stone archway where funeral processions used to pass through. It was intact, rusted, but solid. No rope, no access, no reason it should have moved. I circled it once, then turned to sweep the rows of graves, every stone in its place, every mound of dirt untouched. I even checked the back gate, locked tight, just like I'd left it. The whole cemetery was undisturbed, but the echo of that bell clung to the air like smoke, lingering just long enough to make me wonder if it had ever stopped. I stood there for what felt like an hour, waiting for something. Footsteps, a voice, even a trick of the wind. Nothing came, just silence, heavier than usual. When I returned to the caretaker's house at the edge of the property, I checked the time again. 3:34, and as I closed the door behind me, I caught myself turning to look over my shoulder, not out of habit, but because I was certain something had followed me back. The next morning, I woke up before the sun, my head still buzzing from the night before. I didn't dream, or if I did, I couldn't remember a single image, only that sensation of something unfinished. I brewed coffee, skipped breakfast, and went straight for the shed where the old cemetery records are kept. If the bell had somehow rung again, there had to be a reason. Maybe a mechanical glitch, maybe a prank. Maybe some teenager had managed to climb the old tower and yank it just to get a scare out of the old man who guards the dead. But when I pulled out the maintenance logs, I hit a wall. According to the records, the bell's internal mechanism had been fully removed in 1976. Not just disconnected, dismantled. The entry from that year was written in careful blue ink by a man named Reuben Till, the caretaker before me, and it read, "Final disassembly of toll mechanism. Bell remains ornamental. No future maintenance required." I hadn't thought about Reuben in years. He trained me when I started, and he was a man who believed in silence more than instructions. He died in his sleep a year after retirement. No family, no service. Just me and 2 gravediggers lowering him into the ground. His name is carved on a plain stone not far from the chapel. I decided to climb the tower myself. I hadn't done that in over 2 decades. The stairs were narrow and iron, covered in dust, but the structure was surprisingly stable. At the top, I saw it, still hanging in the center like it had always been there. The bell. Large, blackened bronze, streaked with age, its mouth pointed toward the earth as if it were listening. But the strangest thing wasn't the bell itself. It was the fact that there was nothing attached to it. No rope, no lever, not even a pulley or bracket where a rope might have been. It simply hung there, suspended from an iron arch welded directly into the beams. I stepped closer and reached out without thinking, half expecting it to be cold. But it wasn't. The metal was warm, almost hot. I yanked my hand back like I'd touched a stove. The sun had barely risen. There was no way it could have absorbed that much heat, not after a 40-degree night and a stone tower with no insulation. I checked for birds, animals, anything that might have triggered the sound. Nothing. I was alone, but the floorboards creaked under my boots in a slow rhythm that didn't match my steps. like someone else had just walked out. Back downstairs, I searched the cemetery database. I called the municipal office, asked about any repairs, upgrades, anything that might explain it. They had no file, no blueprint, no record that the bell had ever been part of the tower at all. To them, it was listed as a decorative feature, non-functional. I stared at the phone in my hand, the dial tone humming like a pulse in my ear. That night, I didn't sleep. I waited, watching the clock, and sure enough, when the red digits rolled to 3:17, I heard it again. One low chime. But this time, I swear it wasn't from the tower. It was closer. The third night, I didn't wait for the sound to come. I was already awake, sitting by the window with the lights off, watching the graveyard bathed in blue shadows. The frost hadn't set yet, but the air had that stillness, that breathless chill that only settles right before something begins. I didn't glance at the clock this time. I knew what time it was the moment it happened. One solitary chime, again, low and hollow, as if struck from within the earth. But there was something else now. A voice, not loud, not panicked. It was soft, almost reverent. A string of syllables I didn't understand at first, but the cadence was unmistakable. It was a prayer, a whispered chant, rhythmically spoken in what sounded like Latin, the kind of murmur you might hear in an ancient chapel before a body is lowered, or over a child's crib in times when people feared the night more than they feared death. I slipped on my boots, grabbed my flashlight, and stepped into the cold. The path down to the gate crunched beneath my feet, dry leaves curling like old parchment. The cemetery itself was untouched, no grave disturbed, no sign of digging or footprints. But when I turned the corner toward the iron gate at the far edge of the property, I froze. On the ground, just in front of the locked entrance, were 3 white candles. They were still burning. No wind, no flicker. The wax hadn't dripped more than a finger's width, which meant they'd been lit minutes ago. I scanned the road beyond, but there was nothing. No cars, no footsteps in the gravel, just the flickering light and the stillness that followed the prayer. The strange thing was, I hadn't heard any door open, no clang from the front gate, and I keep that padlock sealed every night. I leaned in closer. The wax smelled like myrrh, an old church smell, one I hadn't breathed in since my mother's funeral decades ago. I picked up one of the candles, still warm, no markings, just white wax and a black wick. I glanced up at the tower. No movement. The bell sat still in its frame. But the sound I'd heard? It didn't come from above. It came from here, ground level. And more than that, it felt directional, like it had emerged from just beyond the gate, as if someone had spoken it inches from the bars, as if I had missed them by seconds. I reached through the iron with my flashlight and swept the beam across the road. Nothing. Not a car. Not a figure. Not even a shadow to blame. But just as I turned to head back toward the office, I felt something shift under my boots. A low vibration, barely perceptible, like the hum of something heavy moving below the surface. I looked down and noticed the dirt near the candles had a shallow depression, like someone had knelt there. And in the center of that depression, embedded just below the loose gravel, was a single rusted nail. I didn't touch it. I didn't pick it up. I just stood there, frozen, as the candle flame went out on its own, without wind, without motion. The next morning, I returned. The nail was gone. That night I didn't sleep. Not because I was afraid, though by then something deeper than fear had taken root in me, but because I had to know if it would happen again. I sat on the porch with a thermos of burnt coffee, staring at the cemetery through the black mesh of trees, waiting for 3:17. I didn't check the time. I didn't need to. When the moment arrived, the air around me shifted, not colder, but heavier, as though I had stepped into a church where no one had spoken for centuries. Then it came, the single toll of the bell, not from the tower, not from the gate, but closer now, much closer. This time, I could swear it had come from within the cemetery grounds, and as the sound settled like dust on the air, I felt it, not through my ears, but through the soles of my feet. A vibration, subtle, but unmistakable. I walked slowly toward the eastern row, past the older graves with worn names and half-erased dates. That's when I noticed it. The earth itself was responding. Not shaking in chaos, but pulsing in rhythm, like a drum beat, like breathing. The headstones didn't move, but the soil beneath them exhaled in tremors. I stopped in front of one grave in particular. The marker was cracked, not like from weather or time, but a fresh fracture, thin as a vein, running down the middle of the stone. I knelt beside it, and that's when I saw it. A mist, faint and colorless, leaking through the crack in the soil, like a whisper trying to escape. My hand reached out instinctively to touch the dirt. The ground was cold, but not dead cold. Alive cold, like skin submerged in icy water. And beneath it, something harder. Metal. Not a coffin, not wood, but something that hummed. I pressed my palm flat and the vibration grew. It matched the toll I still heard echoing in the back of my skull. Except now, it wasn't echo. It was presence. The bell wasn't just ringing, it was beneath me, inside the earth, inside something, maybe inside everything. I stood up and stepped back. That's when I noticed more of them. Tiny cracks, delicate as spider webs, had begun to appear on other stones nearby, and the mist was spreading. Just a wisp from each grave, rising like breath from lips that had never exhaled. No wind moved the trees, no animals stirred. Even the insects had gone silent. But the graves, they were waking, not opening, not breaking, just vibrating, pulsing with something ancient and wrong. I turned to leave, and for a moment I thought I'd imagined it. But as I walked, every footstep I took, every patch of grass I crossed, seemed to trigger the same rhythm beneath me, as if the bell wasn't in one place anymore, as if it had scattered into the ground, fragmented, embedded. I reached the office, closed the door behind me, and leaned my back against it, trying to steady my breath. But the bell never stopped. Not truly. It had just changed its location. Now it was everywhere, beneath the trees, beneath the stones, beneath my feet. And when I lay down to rest at dawn, I swore I could still feel it. Beneath my bed, beneath the floor, beneath the skin on my chest, like it was preparing a place for itself. I no longer needed an alarm. My body stirred on its own, always at the same time. 3:17. But this morning, it wasn't the bell that woke me. It was the sensation that my own heartbeat no longer belonged to me. I lay there, unmoving, listening, not to the silence of the cemetery, which had grown so complete it pressed against the ears like wool, but to something internal, a rhythm, hollow, metallic, measured, the same pattern the bell had followed for nights now, except it wasn't distant anymore. It was inside me. I sat up, dizzy, and looked down at my chest. I saw nothing, no mark, no bruise, but the pressure was there. Not pain, something more disturbing, a sense of occupation, like a tenant had moved in beneath my ribs. I stood, put on my coat, and stepped outside. The air was motionless. Even the fog had stopped crawling. My boots crunched faintly against gravel, but that was the only sound, the kind of silence that felt curated, deliberate. I walked without knowing where my legs were taking me, guided by the weight in my chest, which now pulled gently but firmly, like a leash from the inside. Past the chapel, past the row of mausoleums no one visited anymore, toward the southern edge of the grounds where the soil turned marshy and the older stones leaned like tired men. And there, between two willow trees that I could have sworn had never been there before, was a grave I did not recognize. Not just unfamiliar, impossible. The earth was freshly turned, the headstone clean, unmarred by time or rain. My name was etched into the stone in deep, precise letters. No date of birth, just a line where the death date should have been. Empty, waiting. Atop the grave was something that made my lungs freeze. The bell. Not a replica, not a trick of the eye. The same bell from the tower, the gate, the dreams. Except it was no longer fixed to wood or stone. It rested directly on the grave like a crown on a closed casket. As I stepped closer, the air thickened, and with every footstep, the bell vibrated slightly, as if responding to my proximity. It didn't ring. It didn't need to. I could feel its call from inside my chest now, syncing with my pulse, mapping itself to the rhythm of my breath. A unity I hadn't asked for, hadn't accepted, but now couldn't undo. I reached toward the bell with one hand. It was warm. Not just warm, alive, like flesh warmed by blood. As I touched it, a sudden jolt shot through my palm and up my arm. I staggered back. Behind me, the cemetery had shifted. The stones no longer stood where I remembered. The paths curved in directions they hadn't before, and the sky above wasn't just dark. It was void, a deep nothingness where no stars dared remain. I turned back to the grave and found something worse than the bell, worse than the inscription. My shadow was gone. The ground beneath me didn't reflect anything. I looked at my feet and saw no outline, no presence, just the soil, pulsing faintly, in time with the thing inside my chest. The grave was mine, but it was not for me to enter. It was for me to guard. The bell had moved inside me not to take me, but to use me. I was now its tower, its vessel. Its toll would no longer need a rope or a wind. It would come when I breathed. And I realized, with a clarity so cold it numbed the back of my teeth, it would toll for others now, for those who stepped too close, for those who still believed the dead were at rest. Story 2. It started on a Monday, the kind that draped itself over the cemetery like damp linen. The crew had come in early, tasked with resurfacing the old southern wing, an area long paved in concrete, never once used for burial. Drainage, power conduits, maintenance access, that's all it ever was. I'd walked that stretch for years, swept its edges, patched its cracks. So when the foreman called me over, pale and pacing, I didn't expect to see a grave, let alone one that looked older than the cemetery itself. The slab was stone, but not like anything we had used. Not granite, not marble. More like petrified bone, veined and uneven, like it had been carved under pressure by something that didn't care for symmetry. There was no plaque, no date, just a shape that bulged subtly from the concrete, like it had grown there overnight. No cracks radiated outward, no sign of cutting tools. The cement around it hadn't been disturbed, and yet it was perfectly fitted, as if poured around the stone itself decades ago. The workers backed away. One crossed himself. I stepped closer and touched the surface. It was warm. That was the first thing I couldn't explain. The second was the way the air changed. Normally, even in the colder months, there's a kind of static quiet in cemeteries. Birds, distant cars, maybe the rustle of leaves. But there, around that grave, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt full, like something was listening. One of the younger workers made a joke, said maybe we'd unearthed some cursed colonial relic, and the others laughed, but none of them stayed past lunch. They packed up early. I stayed behind, more out of routine than courage. Part of my job, after all, is recording new graves, even if they appear unnaturally. That evening I brought out the crowbar, not to open it, at least not at first, just to see if it moved. It didn't. It didn't give so much as a shiver. But there was a seam, a fine, almost imperceptible outline running down the middle, like a lid. Against better judgment, I worked the bar in. There was no resistance, no hiss of air escaping, no smell of rot. The top lifted easily, and inside, resting at the center of the stone chamber, was a folded newspaper. Yellowed, yes, but crisp, untouched by time or moisture. I didn't recognize the masthead. The ink looked modern, but there was no date. Only a single page was marked, creased clean down the center. The obituaries, and that was the third thing I couldn't explain. My hands trembled as I unfolded it fully. The names were familiar, too familiar. People I'd passed on the street that week. Names from mailboxes. A former teacher, the town librarian. And last on the list, in bold letters so black they seemed wet, mine. First name, middle initial, last name, no misspellings. Underneath it, the time was printed clearly. 4:16 a.m., tomorrow. I laughed. I did, out loud there in the dark. The kind of laugh you let out when you're trying to convince yourself the punchline hasn't landed yet. Then I tucked the paper under my arm, shut the lid of the grave, and walked away with my heart hammering like a second clock inside my chest. Tomorrow was only hours away. I didn't sleep that night. I told myself it was the coffee, or maybe the cold that had crept into my bones after crouching too long beside something that wasn't supposed to exist. But I knew better. I kept the newspaper on my desk, staring at the fold, waiting for the ink to fade or run, waiting for the names to vanish like heat from breath. But the paper didn't change. It remained as crisp and dry as when I found it, no matter how many times I read through those obituaries. And I read them again and again, mouthing each syllable like I could disprove it if I said it wrong enough times. But the names stuck. Not just mine, but the others. Names that had no business being on a death list. Young people, healthy ones. People I saw at the diner, the high school gym teacher, the woman who brought her dog to walk along the fence line every Thursday. The first death came before dawn. I wasn't there, but I heard about it on the radio the next morning. Tragic accident, the announcer said. A driver had swerved off the main road into an embankment. No foul play suspected. I waited for the name. When it came, my hand froze on the steering wheel. It was one of them, third on the list. I pulled over and opened the paper again. Her name was now underlined. A faint check mark next to the time. My own name remained where it was. Last. Untouched. But the time was drawing closer. I didn't tell anyone. What was I supposed to say? That a grave appeared under solid concrete with a death list printed in a newspaper from nowhere? That it claimed I'd be gone by 4:16 tomorrow morning and was already batting 1 for 1? So I said nothing. I kept it to myself and tried to pretend the world hadn't tilted in a way no compass could fix. But it wasn't just the paper. The grave didn't go away. I checked the concrete slab the next afternoon. Still seamless, still impossibly flush, still warm. The second death was faster. A man found slumped in his shed, no sign of distress. They said it was natural causes, but he was only 50, and I'd spoken to him the day before. He'd seemed fine, planning to repaint his back porch. His name was on the list too. Fourth down. I stared at the growing marks beside the names, each one confirming the impossible. I began to realize something colder than death itself. This wasn't a prediction. It was a schedule. That evening I tried to destroy the paper. I burned a corner with a match, but it didn't take. The flame curled around it, then retreated like it had been told to stop. I doused it in water. Nothing. Not even a blur. I tore it down the center, but when I looked again, the rip had vanished. The print had realigned as if my hands had never touched it. And the worst part was what happened next. A new name appeared. Fresh ink. I recognized it instantly. The kid from the grocery store. 18. Quiet. Always wore the same green hoodie. His name slid onto the page just below mine, like the list wasn't getting longer. It was getting closer. The time next to his name? 4:10. Just before mine. And suddenly, tomorrow didn't feel like it was hours away. It felt like it was already behind me, just waiting for me to catch up. I started hiding the newspaper. Beneath floorboards, inside locked drawers, behind the furnace where even the spiders avoided crawling. But no matter where I left it, I'd find it again, neatly folded on my desk each morning, resting on top of the register book like it belonged there, like it had always been there. I stopped trying to deny it. Instead, I started watching it, waiting to catch it in the act of changing. At first the shifts were subtle, a time adjusted by a minute, a last name reformatted. But then one morning, a name that had been listed for the following week vanished completely. That afternoon, I overheard someone in town mention she'd moved to Florida to be closer to family, without warning, without saying goodbye. It wasn't death, but she was gone, unreachable, like the paper had accounted for something else entirely. The changes became bolder. Names appeared while I was looking right at the page. I blinked, and a blank space was suddenly filled with bold letters and birth dates. I blinked again, and someone else's cause of death was added beside mine. Found at origin site, time verified. I didn't know what origin site meant until I realized it was referring to the impossible grave, the one under the concrete. That was the origin. And I was to be found there, like the others. Like the newspaper already had the headline drafted and ready to publish. I tried calling the county records office, asked them to check the death logs just to reassure myself I was losing my mind. They had no record of the people I mentioned. Not dead, not alive, just removed. No listing found, the clerk repeated, like an answering machine stuck on a loop. I thanked her, hung up, and opened the paper again. A red line had appeared under my name. The first color I'd seen on the page. Not black, not gray. Red, underlined, bolded, time-stamped. A correction, maybe. Or a warning. I stared at the paper until my eyes blurred. I kept thinking about that phrase, found at origin site. It wasn't predicting where they'd find me. It was giving me a location. It wanted me to return, to stand where the stone tomb had been. But there was no more tomb. The workers had poured fresh concrete days ago, covering the site like it never existed. Still, I couldn't shake the thought that it wasn't buried. It had sunk, or worse, it had never been there in the first place. The stone had risen to the surface only when the list needed to begin. Late that night, I woke to a creak on the porch. I didn't check the door. I already knew. The paper had updated again. One name removed, one added. Mine had shifted to the top, timestamp intact, but now there was a note below it in smaller text. Pending final entry. My hands trembled as I reached for a pen, unsure why I was even holding it. The only thing I knew for certain was this. If the list could change, then maybe, just maybe, I could change it too. And when I pressed the ink to the margin, added a new name beneath mine, just one, I felt something shift in the room. A breath that wasn't mine, a weight leaving my chest and settling somewhere outside the window. The paper accepted the change. My time moved, but not far, not nearly far enough. By the third morning, I noticed something strange in the northeast corner of the cemetery, near the old drainage ditch no one ever went near. A stone I didn't remember was there now. It was the same cold gray as the tomb we found under the concrete, weathered in a way that didn't match time. But wait. I walked over, running my hand across the face of it. No name, not yet, but the shape, the angles. It belonged to the same lineage as that first impossible grave. That afternoon, another one appeared, then two more by the end of the week. I hadn't dug a single hole. I hadn't filed a single burial record. Yet the earth shifted, and the stones rose from it like teeth. I tried marking the new plots on my map, thinking I'd trace a pattern. I redrew the cemetery grid 3 times. Nothing made sense, until I stopped looking at the rows and started looking at the distance between each grave. The layout wasn't linear. It was circular, like something was forming in the center. Like the first tomb, the one under the concrete, had been the beginning of a spiral, and the rest of the stones were falling into place. Each night, I stayed up watching from the chapel window, and each dawn, the curve grew sharper, more complete. By the time I counted 12 new gravestones, I gave up pretending I had control. The shovel hadn't left the shed in days. No trucks had come, no workers returned. The cemetery was building itself. Every grave matched the names that had passed through the newspaper. Every single one. No ceremony, no procession, just emergence. Like the earth was correcting an absence that had gone unnoticed for too long. I stood one evening on the roof of the caretaker's shed, looking down at the layout. It wasn't just a spiral, it was a noose, a loop tightening toward the center, and directly in the middle, outlined by a low mist I could not explain, was the spot where we'd found the first grave. The tomb that wasn't supposed to be there, the one with my name in the obituary. It hadn't reappeared, but something else had. A depression in the ground, bare dirt, breathing. I thought I saw movement then, just beneath the soil. Not something trying to rise, but something stirring gently, like a heartbeat under blankets. The mist thickened when I stepped forward. The chill went deeper than my bones. I turned to walk back, but the gravel path behind me was different, shorter, more curved, as though the spiral had adjusted. I wasn't just observing anymore. I was inside the shape, part of the formation. I hadn't read the newspaper in 2 days, afraid to look, but I didn't need to. I already knew the next name. Mine was in the center, but someone else was now at the edge. Someone I had written in, believing I could bargain. I had shifted the ink and thought it would save me, but I was beginning to realize the circle was not a trap. It was a countdown. And every name added brought it closer to closing. When it did, I didn't think the newspaper would print anything else, because there wouldn't be anyone left to read it. The newspaper was still there, folded neatly beneath my cot, as if it had never moved since the day I found it, except I knew that wasn't true. The pages turned themselves when I wasn't looking. The ink darkened on its own, and each time I dared to check, the list grew closer to me, like a breath on the back of my neck. My name no longer sat at the bottom. It was third, then second, and now the top. John T. Marin, caretaker, 4:16 a.m. The hour hadn't changed, just the proximity, the inevitability. It was 1:03 a.m. when I decided to try again. I'd burned it before. The paper refused to catch. I buried it. It returned. I tore it to pieces. By morning, it was whole again, folded, pristine, and waiting. But one night, in a moment of desperation, I scribbled a name over mine. Not random, not innocent. Someone who'd wronged me long ago. Someone whose death would not be mourned. And something shifted. The moment I replaced my name, the newspaper twitched like something alive. The obituary changed. Mine vanished. The new name appeared, along with a fresh grave by sunrise, angled at the edge of the spiral, the outermost ring. I had done it. I'd broken the pattern. But that same morning, I vomited soil, thick, black, and wet. My reflection in the mirror blinked half a second late, and in the cemetery, a new marker grew. Not for the man I had replaced, but for someone else entirely. The stone bore my handwriting. I hadn't carved it, but I had written it once, on the list. I realized then that I hadn't avoided my fate. I'd only bought time, or worse, paid with someone else's. By the following night, the circle was complete. 32 graves, perfectly spaced, encircling the original tomb that had sunk back into the earth like it had never been found. But now, in its place, there was a stone basin, empty, waiting. The newspaper sat inside, and this time, when I lifted it, the ink bled across the page. Not randomly. It spelled a phrase I had never seen before. The survivor writes the next. That's when I understood. Every name I had added, every substitution, every act of self-preservation, it had fed the loop, given it fuel. The newspaper wasn't an artifact. It was a contract. The only way out was to fill the page. And when there were no names left, mine would return. I stared at the basin, the cold stone humming beneath my hands. There was a pen beside the newspaper now. Not mine, not modern. A long black fountain pen with no brand and a red-stained nib. It pulsed. I could write another name. I could buy another week, another month. But each word would carve a death. I knew that now. Each line I wrote was a chisel in someone else's stone, and the final space was already taken. It wasn't my name there anymore. It just read, "The last author." I wasn't the victim. I wasn't even the caretaker anymore. I was the next writer, the one who decides, and maybe the one who gets buried last. Story 3. It started on a Tuesday, a windless, ordinary night, the kind that settles over a cemetery like a thick, indifferent blanket. The security system had just finished its weekly auto update, and the new cameras, 6 in total, were supposed to be testing low-light infrared recording. The groundskeeper, an older man named Wallace who had worked the graveyard shift in more ways than one for over 20 years, reviewed the footage out of boredom, expecting raccoons, maybe a fox. But what he saw instead made him sit up straighter in his small wooden office just behind the chapel ruins. At exactly 2:46 a.m., a figure appeared on camera 3. Small, thin, the height of a child, a girl, dressed in something pale. Could have been white, could have been gray. The color bled into the night around her. She walked slowly, never stopping, never running. She didn't glance at the graves, didn't look up at the stars, or around her at the stones that stood crooked like old teeth in the damp earth. Just forward, straight through the same narrow path between 3 specific graves. Row B, plots 14, 15, and 16. Then just as she reached the far edge of the lens's frame, she vanished. Wallace scrubbed through the footage again and again, looking for signs of trickery, lens flare, camera lag, some glitch in the motion detection. But she was there, every frame, and then she wasn't. Curious, but not yet alarmed, he bookmarked the video and went out the next night with a flashlight and a thermos of black coffee, leaning against the chapel wall as the clock on his phone crept toward the same time. Nothing. The grass swayed. The wind didn't stir. No child. Not in person, at least. But when he came back in and checked the live feed from camera 3, she had appeared again. 2:46 a.m. on the dot. And once more, she passed the same 3 graves and vanished into the corner behind the old chapel. It became a ritual. Every night, the same girl, same time, same path, no sound. The motion sensors registered her faintly, just enough to trigger, but never enough to log heat. Wallace upgraded the camera, switched lenses, adjusted lighting. One night, he even left out a box of sand across the grass, hoping to catch footprints. But by morning, it was undisturbed. She never smiled, never blinked, and she always disappeared behind the chapel, the one condemned after the fire back in 1983. The fire no one talked about anymore. He went back through years of footage. Nothing before this week. It was as if she had simply begun, like a program written into the cemetery's fabric. A loop, the kind that didn't wait for belief. Wallace found himself thinking things he hadn't thought in decades. About spirits, about thin places between one world and the next. The way her form flickered in the edges of the lens, always grainy, as if the camera was trying not to see her. Always silent, always at 2:46, and always walking toward that ruined place where no living child should be. Wallace hadn't set foot inside the old chapel in more than a decade. Not since the last storm had collapsed part of the southern wall and left the structure leaning like a drunk who'd forgotten how to stand. Signs hung on rusted chains warned of unstable flooring and falling debris. But on the morning after the fourth consecutive appearance of the child, he found himself standing at the edge of that blackened doorway, holding a crowbar in one hand and a flashlight in the other. The boards that once sealed the entrance were scattered, like something had pushed them out from the inside. And there, thick in the air, was a smell that shouldn't have existed: charcoal, scorched wood, and the sharp sweetness of melted wax, like the fire had ended just yesterday. He stepped carefully into the ash-laced interior. Dust floated in shafts of dim morning light, but the ground was still marked, not with boot prints or animal tracks, but small, delicate indentations in the soot, bare feet, tiny ones, leading down the aisle between what remained of the pews, curving behind the altar to the back wall. Wallace followed them slowly, his breath tight, heart pushing hard in his chest. The prints stopped at the wall, a stone wall, solid, no doors, no windows, nothing but uneven stone and thick mortar blackened by time and flame. Yet the ash there was disturbed, pushed aside as if something, or someone, had passed straight through. He reached out and touched the stone. It was warm. Not from sunlight, not from air, from something within. Wallace pulled his hand back like he'd been burned. For a moment he swore he heard something on the other side. A soft exhale, then silence again. He turned and scanned the interior. The place looked long dead. The crucifix was gone, probably stolen years ago. The pulpit lay split in half. But along the walls, in certain places where soot hadn't settled, were faint lines. Childish drawings scratched into the wood with what looked like fingernails. Flowers, suns, a stick figure with pigtails. He snapped photos on his phone. They were blank when he checked later, just static. That night he returned with candles. Perhaps it was a foolish instinct, but the smell of wax had lingered in his thoughts. He lit 3 and placed them on the cracked altar. As their flames rose, the air in the chapel seemed to shift. Lighter, thinner. He waited. 2:46 a.m. came again, and the child appeared once more on the camera, walking, unblinking. She vanished at the same spot. But when he reviewed the feed later, something had changed. Just for a single frame, just for the blink between motion and stillness, the camera caught her inside the chapel, standing in front of the altar, looking at him. The candle beside her had gone out, and for the first time, Wallace smelled the fire again. But this time, it followed him home. Wallace had always trusted paper more than memory, so when the child kept appearing, same time, same path, same vanishing point, he did what he knew best. He went digging, not in the dirt this time, but in the archives. The county hall still kept microfilmed records from before the fire, though the clerks had long since stopped cataloging anything related to the chapel after it was condemned. He asked for burial logs, funeral service notes, anything from 1983. The clerk raised an eyebrow. "That's the year it burned down," she said. Nobody kept much after that, but she still rolled out the reel. Hours passed in the stale hum of the microfiche machine. Most records were mundane: hymns selected, attendance notes, bills for candles and flower arrangements. But then came a service with no name. April 16th, 1983. Listed only as juvenile unknown. No family. No official cause of death, only a scribbled line in shaky cursive. Presumed lost in chapel fire. But just below that, in faded pencil, one word had been circled and crossed out so many times it tore the paper slightly. Eleanor. Wallace leaned back, skin prickling. He whispered the name aloud, and in that moment, the library lights flickered. He printed the record and took it with him, hands trembling slightly as he locked his truck and headed back to the cemetery. That night, before the clock even struck 2:46, he turned on the monitor. The cameras showed empty graves, swaying tree branches, the same cold hush of early morning. But then the static shifted. One frame, just one, showed her again. Not walking this time. Standing. Not moving forward but turned slightly, as if aware of being watched. And then came the whisper. He didn't imagine it. The system had audio. It had never recorded sound before. But now, clear and slow and unmistakable, came the creak of burning wood, and then softly, the word, Eleanor. Wallace's blood ran cold. The next morning he returned to the chapel with the printed record. The soot was disturbed again, this time not only by footsteps, but by something more deliberate. Someone had traced the name Eleanor in the ash, perfectly mirroring the signature on the church record. He bent down and reached toward it, but as his fingers neared, the ash scattered by itself, not by wind. There was no wind. It simply recoiled. That night, he brought a tape recorder and placed it inside the chapel. He left it running and locked the door. At dawn, when he retrieved it, there was only one thing captured: the sound of a girl humming something soft and slow, barely a tune, followed by the unmistakable crunch of footsteps on burned wood, then silence. But when he rewound the tape to listen again, the first thing it played wasn't humming at all. It was his own voice, saying her name, and he hadn't said it out loud since leaving the library. By the fourth night, Wallace had stopped questioning whether it was real. The routine had settled into his bones like damp in old wood. Dinner cold, coffee black, cameras on, eyes fixed to the grainy feed at 2:45. She never came early. She never came late. She always moved the same way. Bare feet, brushing dew-slick grass, dress hem swaying just enough to suggest a breeze, though the trees around her never stirred. And as always, she passed between the same three graves before disappearing behind the fire-scarred chapel, into a side no camera could penetrate. This time, Wallace would meet her there. He left the lights off in his office, stepped into the dark with his coat barely zipped. No flashlight, just the soft crunch of gravel under his boots as he moved between rows of silent stones. The moon was high and thin, throwing enough silver to cast shadows, but never enough to feel safe. He crouched behind a crumbling monument and waited. At 2:46, she came. He could hear her first, the whisper of footsteps so light they barely shifted the grass. Then the shape, emerging like breath on glass, pale and deliberate. He didn't move, didn't blink. As she neared the chapel, Wallace counted. One step past the McIntyre stone, another near the twins' shared plot. A third, just inches from the grave marked Mother. She turned toward the chapel, never looking left or right, and walked toward the eastern wall. And then she vanished. Not like a trick of the fog, not like someone stepping behind a tree. She passed through solid stone. Wallace ran to the spot. Nothing. Just scorched brick, rotting mortar, weeds. He tapped the wall, pressed against it. Still there. No illusion, no hidden doorway. Just the impossible. The next day, Wallace returned with tools, a chisel, a flashlight, a crowbar that hadn't left the shed in 15 years. He waited for daylight to burn through the fog and approached the eastern wall again. Carefully, he chipped away at the cracked surface, inch by inch, until his fingers struck hollow space. Behind the outer brick, a cavity, small, maybe 3 feet wide. He pulled loose the debris, peering into the dust. His flashlight trembled as it revealed what had been entombed behind the wall for 4 decades. Charred fragments of bone, a scorched metal pendant, a melted plastic toy, and then, folded neatly and untouched by time or flame, a small, hand-sewn dress. Blue cotton, yellow stitching, lace along the collar. On the inside of the neck, a name embroidered in fading red thread. Eleanor. He didn't breathe. The space behind the wall was not a room. It was a grave, not marked, not known, hidden behind the sanctuary where prayers had once echoed and now only silence answered. He didn't tell the authorities. Who would believe it? A tomb that walked, a name that whispered back. That night, he stayed in the chapel. Just him, a candle, and the dress laid across the altar like an offering. And at 2:46, she returned. But this time, she did not walk toward the chapel. She stood at its door, waiting. He didn't sleep that morning. He couldn't. After the girl's silent return to the chapel door, after she stood motionless, gazing into him without moving her lips, but somehow speaking directly to the nerves in his spine, Wallace had stayed kneeling until dawn bled through the stained glass ruins. The dress remained on the altar, untouched. The candle had gone out without burning to the end. He rose slowly, every joint aching with something deeper than fatigue. Outside, the cemetery lay quiet, under a thin layer of frost, the headstones casting long shadows that didn't quite align with the sun. It wasn't until he made his way back toward the caretaker's office that he noticed it. Between the 3 graves she always passed, just where the grass had always been patchy but familiar, a new headstone stood. Not modern, not polished. Stone older than the rest, weathered and uneven, etched in a style he hadn't seen outside antique museums. But the earth was freshly turned, as if someone had dug and filled it just hours before. He approached it slowly, already knowing what name he would find. Eleanor Grace Holloway, 1976, 1983. He staggered back. He'd never seen that stone, never approved it. No record, no request. He crouched and touched the inscription. It was real. The edges of the carving were soft but firm beneath his fingers. He didn't know whether to cry or run. His hands trembled as he pulled out his phone to take a picture. The screen glitched, static lines across the image. He tried again. Nothing. The phone rebooted itself, but when it returned, the image folder was empty. No photos, no trace. Just as he lowered the device, he heard it, faint behind him. Laughter. Not cruel, not mocking, but light, brief, like a child hiding behind a corner. He turned toward the chapel, but there was nothing there. That night, Wallace reviewed the security footage. He expected the same pattern, 2:46 a.m., the girl appearing, walking, disappearing, but this time something different. She emerged at the same time, followed the same path, but when she reached the 3 graves, she stopped. She looked up, straight into the camera. Her face, previously blurred or turned, was clear now, delicate, solemn. Her eyes didn't blink, and then, as the wind blew her hair gently to one side, she smiled, a slow, peaceful smile. Then she turned, not toward the chapel, but toward the new grave. She stepped behind it and vanished. The footage ended in a burst of static. Wallace closed the laptop and stared at the dark screen. He felt lighter somehow. The oppressive weight of her wandering presence, the dread that had clung to his bones for weeks, had lifted. The girl was gone. Or perhaps she had never truly been lost, just waiting for someone to uncover what had been buried in secret, waiting for someone to finally write her name where it belonged. And still, even now, when Wallace walks the grounds in the morning mist, he sometimes hears footsteps behind him, small, light, familiar, but he doesn't turn around. He doesn't need to. She isn't lost anymore. She's home. Story 4. The night had settled over the cemetery like wet cloth, heavy and slow, and the only sound was the distant rustling of brittle leaves pushed along by a wind too lazy to commit. The caretaker, Thomas Weller, was on his usual round, a ritual more than a necessity after all these years. The north wing of the cemetery was rarely visited anymore, a stretch of land tucked behind old mausoleums and iron fences, now blanketed in vines. It had once held prestige, the final resting place of the town's oldest families. But ever since the electric grid was shut down on that side decades ago due to cost and erosion, few even bothered to walk near it. Thomas had memorized every step, every crack in the pavement, every rusted plaque faded by time. So when he saw the faint orange glow seeping through the fog ahead, his first thought wasn't ghosts or electricity, it was disorientation. But the closer he got, the more undeniable it became. One of the tall iron lampposts, that lined the gravel path was lit, fully, solidly, and breathing. He stopped just short of the light's reach, uncertain whether to trust his eyes or the weight in his chest. The bulb wasn't buzzing, nor flickering like the gas-fed ones from his youth. Instead, it pulsed in a slow rhythm, dimming slightly, then brightening again, as though responding to something unseen. And that's when he noticed the glass. The bulb was not frosted like the others, nor clear. It was etched. No, not etched. Carved. Inside the thick glass, barely visible unless you were close enough to feel the warmth on your skin, a name circled the inner dome. R. Halloway. Thomas staggered back as the realization crept in. Ronald Halloway had died that morning. Heart attack. Alone. He hadn't even been scheduled for interment yet. His body was still at the funeral home. Thomas leaned in again, unsure if this was some prank or if his mind had finally begun to turn on him. The name remained. The light continued its slow inhale and exhale of glow. There were no wires at the base of the lamppost. He knew that for certain. He'd seen the town crews cut them off himself nearly 3 decades prior. He reached up, placing his palm gently against the metal casing of the bulb. It was warm, not burning, but unmistakably alive. A heat that felt old. That night, he didn't sleep. He returned to his tiny quarters near the gatehouse and sat in the dark, the image of that single illuminated name burning brighter behind his eyes than it had in the fog. There was no logic to it, no science, no precedent, but something had shifted. The north side was waking up, and tomorrow he would walk that path again, to see if the light remained, or if another had joined it. He didn't know yet that the answer would come in twos, or that each light would carry a name, or that one day, one of them would carry his. By the time Thomas returned to the northern wing the following night, he already knew what he hoped and feared to find. The first lamp still glowed, faithful in its silent breathing. But it wasn't alone anymore. A second post, farther down the path, now bore its own soft halo, more subtle, flickering faintly, like a candle on its last hour. He stood between the two lights, chilled by the stillness of the air. The new bulb looked slightly older, the glass more clouded, but again, within the core of the light, a name pulsed gently from within. Monsieur Delaney. It took him a moment to place it. Margaret Delaney, a widow, still alive as far as he knew. He'd seen her the previous week at the market, haggling over tomatoes with the same fire she'd carried for 40 years. And yet, her name was there, encased inside a lamp that should not be working. That night he began a list. He wrote both names down in his notebook, with dates and locations of the posts, like some deranged astronomer charting stars that shouldn't be there. The third lamp lit up the next evening, then a fourth. Each one displaying a different name, none repeated, none forgotten. He tried to match them against the town's public records, birth certificates, hospital notes, obituaries, but there was no pattern, no diseases, no shared addresses, no specific demographic, just names, some young, some old, all still living, for now. When he approached the town hall to consult the original cemetery schematics and burial records, he received only polite confusion. The names weren't on any prearranged burial lists. The cemetery had no pending funerals for any of them. But that changed, quickly. Ronald Halloway, whose name lit the first lamp, died 2 days after the light had first flickered. Margaret Delaney collapsed in her garden the morning after her name appeared. The coroner called it natural causes. Thomas didn't agree. He watched each death like a punctuation mark, each life a candle snuffed just as the glow disappeared from its respective post. He became obsessed. He spent nights roaming the paths, flashlight in hand, scanning each lamp for the next name. He started warning the people whose names appeared, quietly, carefully. Margaret's nephew had laughed in his face. A week later, another name appeared, then another. It didn't matter if they listened or didn't. The result was always the same. But one question haunted him more than any other. Why did the names appear before the death? As if the light wasn't mourning but marking. And what happened when no one was left to warn? He didn't say it out loud yet, but he already feared the answer. One night soon, he would find his own name waiting for him, glowing gently in the dark, in glass that should have shattered long ago. Thomas had always trusted maps. Not the glowing rectangles people now held in their hands, but the thick, creased paper ones he kept stacked in his drawer, each fold memorized, each landmark circled in pencil. When the fifth lamp flickered to life on a Monday night, its faint yellow glow drawing a moth-like halo in the mist, he marked its location with care. But the next morning, when he brought a technician from the city's utilities department, hoping to trace the impossible current feeding these lights, they stood in the cold morning fog staring at a stretch of ground where nothing, according to official records, should have existed. "There's no post here," the technician said flatly, tapping his tablet. "Never was. This is just open ground." "But it's there," Thomas insisted, pointing. "Look with your eyes, not your screen." And it was there, plain, silent, humming. Yet when the technician raised his camera to document it, the screen remained black. Not dark, not blurry, black, as if the lens had turned to ash. He tried again. Same result. The technician's face tightened. He took a step back, muttering about interference, shielding the lens with his jacket, switching to his phone. Still nothing. When he aimed the lens elsewhere, it worked fine. Only the lamp, only that glowing glass with a name inside, refused to be seen. That evening, Thomas scoured the city's archives. Floor plans, construction records, electrical grids. The blueprints from 1963 showed 4 posts along the northern wall, but there were now at least 12, and the one he'd seen that morning wasn't on any version, old or new. He even found a copy of a 1949 zoning proposal where the area was just a wooded slope, no mention of light posts, no paved walkways. He thought about calling someone, his brother in Chicago, or maybe even a journalist. But what would he say? That the dead were previewed in glass? That the lights were growing? On the 7th day, another lamp lit up. He knew the name. Harold Pence, a local electrician, just 53, had kids, played softball with the VFW on Sundays. He was also the man who'd checked the panel at the cemetery gate 2 nights before, said there was no power coming in. Dead as a rock, he'd called it. But now his name glowed silently in the 7th post, warm and slow, as if the bulb was breathing with his fading heart. Thomas didn't sleep that night. He walked the rows, checking each light, counting them twice. 12 posts, 11 names, 1 still dark, 1 waiting. When he checked the old map again, something else struck him cold. One of the posts, one of the very ones now standing there, humming with ghostly light, was not only missing from the diagram, it stood over a spot where a body had never been buried. No plot number, no record, just dirt that never belonged to anyone, until now. And still, no wires, no cables, no switch to flip, no circuit to trace. These weren't lamps anymore. They were warnings, markers, not for the living, but for whoever was keeping count. The call came not from the chapel phone, but from the window. It wasn't a sound, not exactly. It was the absence of all other sounds, the kind of silence that pulls your breath back into your chest and makes your teeth ache. Thomas had been dozing in the small cot behind his desk when it happened, an overwhelming brightness spilling across the walls like a floodlight aimed from heaven or somewhere far crueler. He pulled the curtain aside with a shaking hand, expecting maybe a passing car, a lightning strike, even the sheriff's cruiser. But instead, he saw the entire northern path of the cemetery lit in a row, each lamp burning with unnatural intensity, stretching from the tool shed to the wrought iron fence, 12 in total, just as he feared. The ground beneath them glistened as if wet, though the skies had not rained in weeks. Each bulb blinked in rhythm, soft and slow, and within the heart of everyone, names, flickering, shifting, counting. He stepped outside, barefoot, not feeling the cold, eyes locked on the glow. The first post flashed a name, gone. The second, gone. Third, fourth, fifth, gone in sequence, each one extinguishing itself with a soft click as the next lit brighter, as if moving down a line closer and closer. He walked faster, the gravel biting his heels, breath fogging in the sudden sharp chill. His own name wasn't at the start, not in the middle, but as the 11th lamp flickered and faded, Thomas already knew what would come next. The final post, the 12th one, the one that had always remained unlit, now pulsed to life. No flicker, no breath, just a solid, unwavering light, golden but wrong, warm but hollow, and there it was. Thomas C. Everly, not etched like the others, not etched at all. This one was carved from within, like the glass had birthed the letters itself. He didn't know how long he stood there staring, the rest of the cemetery now buried in darkness behind him. Only his name remained lit. He approached the post, reached up, placed his hand against the glass. It was warm, not hot, but alive. The name pulsed beneath his palm like a second heartbeat. Then all the lamps behind him, the ones that had gone dark, shattered at once. No sound, just implosion. Glass rained down in silence. And from somewhere beyond the fence, in the part of the cemetery that had never been mapped, he thought he saw another glow, just beginning. The light wasn't golden this time. It was red. He stopped sleeping after a Kalen wait, not because he couldn't, but because something in his bones warned him that sleep would make the light flicker. And if it flickered, it could go out. So he stayed awake, in the chapel's office, then on the front steps, then under the light itself. A foldable chair, a blanket, coffee that grew cold faster than he could drink it. Every night, the bulb above him hummed, faint but alive, steady as breath. Sometimes he thought it pulsed with his heartbeat. Other times, he suspected it was the other way around. He tried everything. First, the obvious things. He cut the power line, even knowing it carried no current. The bulb stayed on. He threw rocks at it. They bounced back as if the air around the post had thickened. One night he climbed a ladder, brought a hammer, and swung as hard as he could. The glass didn't shatter. Instead, the hammer cracked. And for a second, just a second, the letters of his name inside the bulb burned brighter, as if mocking his effort. Then came the call. Not through any working phone line. He had already torn the cords from the wall in frustration days ago. But the receiver rang anyway, shrill and wrong, like a memory of a sound rather than the thing itself. He picked it up. The voice was gentle, like a whisper through gravel. "As long as your name shines, you still breathe," it said. "But when it fades, you won't be the last." He didn't speak. He couldn't. The line cut off, not with a click, but with a breath, like someone had simply exhaled into his ear and vanished. From then on, he heard the whispers more often, not always through the phone, sometimes through the wind between the graves, sometimes from the bulb itself, its glow forming shapes that were almost words, almost faces. The worst was the day he saw another post flicker in the distance, a new one, not in the north wing, but in the west, where the trees grew thick and the graves were centuries old. He walked out to it and saw a name he didn't recognize. But the next morning, a headline in the local paper reported a sudden death. The name matched, then another, and another. As if the cemetery had resumed a cycle that only his light had paused. He began to understand. His lamp wasn't just warning, it was anchoring, holding the others in place. As long as it remained lit, the rest could wait. But if it went out, if his name ever dimmed, it wouldn't be the end. It would be the start of something worse. So he stayed, beneath that eternal glow, wrapped in wool and silence, waiting not for death, but for the flicker that would mean it was someone else's turn, and wondering, when it did, if he'd finally get to rest, or if the bulb would simply change names. Story 5. It had always been there, at least as far back as anyone remembered, nestled beneath the gnarled elm tree near the northern fence line where the grass never seemed to grow quite right. A headstone, plain and unremarkable at first glance, yet strangely untouched by time. No cracks, no lichen, no erosion. Just a smooth slab of gray stone without a name, without dates, without anything at all. No burial records, no obituary, no ceremony. It stood among a row of older graves as if it belonged. Yet every list the cemetery kept, digitized or handwritten, showed a gap in the numbering system, a space that was never explained. The grave had no official coordinates, and no one could say with certainty when it was placed. Not even the oldest caretaker, Harold, who had been working the grounds since the early 80s, could recall the day it arrived. "It was there when I got here," he always said, with a glance over his shoulder as if the mere mention of it demanded caution. Visitors rarely noticed it. It wasn't hidden, but the eye slid past it the way a person forgets the exact path they took to get home. But for those who did see it, really see it. Something about it felt unfinished, like a gesture interrupted, or a door that's almost closed but never quite clicks shut. More than once, Harold had paused during his rounds, eyes lingering too long on the silent marker, feeling something like pressure building behind his ears, like a storm coming in, even on clear days. The grave never changed. No flowers, no offerings, no disturbed earth, just stillness. Even the air around it felt heavier, as if something beneath it wasn't asleep, just waiting. Over the years, a few workers had brought it up, briefly, hesitantly, as if saying too much might give it attention it didn't deserve. One man quit after digging too close to it during a landscaping project, claimed the ground felt hollow, but not in the way dirt should, like it wasn't made to be touched from above. Felt like stepping on skin, he'd whispered. No one questioned it. No one returned to that side of the plot without a reason, and Harold never gave them one. And still, it stood, unclaimed, unmarked, and completely untouched. Not even the weather dared stain it. There was no record of who had purchased the plot, no receipts, no invoices. The town historian swore the cemetery's original blueprint showed nothing in that spot, a blank square where the tomb now rested. But the stone was real. You could press your palm against it and feel its unnatural chill even in summer. You could measure it, lean against it, knock on it. And if you did, you might hear something. Not a sound exactly, but the feeling of something shifting very far beneath your feet. Something aware, something that had always been there, watching. It began like a clock, with a rhythm too precise to be ignored. Every morning, just as the cemetery's frost-laced silence began to lift, the Covero would hear it, the soft rustle of wings cutting through the still air at exactly 6:03. The first time, he didn't think much of it. A lone black bird circling down from nowhere wasn't exactly unusual in a place like this. But when it landed squarely on the unnamed tomb, tilting its head once, then settling in motionless observation, something felt wrong in a way he couldn't name. It didn't preen. It didn't scan for food. It didn't acknowledge him. It just watched. The next morning, 6:03. Again, the same bird, the same perch. Same gaze locked onto the same blank tombstone like it was waiting for something beneath the stone to finally answer. By the third morning, he started checking his watch. And by the fourth, he was waiting for it. Not out of curiosity, not exactly, but a dull pressure in his chest. Like failing to show up would be breaking a pact he didn't remember making. He tested it, approached slowly one morning with a rake in hand, pretending to be casual. But the closer he got, the colder the air seemed to grow. And when he was within 5 feet, the bird snapped its beak open and let out a sound that made him freeze. Not a caw, not a screech, but something far too human. A dry, hoarse cry, as if someone's throat had been left open mid-breath. It wasn't mimicry. It was memory. He backed away and the bird calmed, returning to its quiet sentinel pose. And it never missed a morning. Other workers began to notice too, whispering about it in break rooms and locker sheds. One of them, Maria, tried to joke about it, said she'd bring birdseed next time. The next morning she arrived 10 minutes late, 6:13. The Corvo was already there, staring. It didn't flinch when she passed. But that afternoon, she slipped on a flat path and broke her wrist in 2 places. Said it felt like something had tugged her from behind. The groundskeeper started to wonder if the bird ever left. One night, near closing, he doubled back and took the long way around to the northern fence. It was empty. But when he checked the next morning, the bird was there again. Same stone, same posture, same unwavering stare. He began dreaming of wings brushing against walls, of eyes watching him from the corners of rooms, of breathless cries and voices that sounded like people he once buried. Not all of them had names. Some were still waiting for one. And always, the bird returned, never landing anywhere else, never answering to noise or presence or threat, just sitting in that exact spot over the grave that no one claimed. And somehow, he began to feel that it was guarding the tomb, not from intruders, but from something trying to get out. Something that didn't belong above ground. Something that the bird alone could hold still with nothing more than that terrible human scream. He never meant to let visitors linger, not in that part of the cemetery. Most came for someone they knew, someone buried in plots neatly arranged, flowers laid gently, names carved with care. But every so often, a wanderer found their way to the north end, to the grave without a name, and to the crow that never moved. It started with a couple in their late 60s. They were lost, maps worn, eyes scanning for the uncle they hadn't seen in years. But when they passed the nameless grave and saw the bird, the woman froze. She didn't blink. Her husband asked what was wrong. She whispered something, barely audible. That sound. There hadn't been a sound. Not yet. But she insisted it was the same noise her brother made when he drowned. Rasping, gargling, then silence. The Cavero thought it was grief, memory playing tricks. Until the next week, when a teenager wandered close during a school tour, earbuds dangling, attention half present. As he neared the grave, the crow opened its beak, and this time, the sound that came out was shrill and panicked, high-pitched and brittle. The boy screamed and dropped to his knees, sobbing. He later told the cemetery staff it was the exact scream his mother had let out when their house burned down. He hadn't heard it in years, not since they pulled her out, not since she died 3 days later in the hospital. And the stories continued. Each person heard something different. Sometimes the cry of a loved one lost too soon. Sometimes a word, a name, spoken in a voice that had once whispered bedtime stories or last goodbyes. The crow never moved, never blinked, but its voice, if that was what it was, shifted like wind through old windows. Not imitation, not mockery, memory, echo, something that didn't belong in feathers and beak. The Cavero tried to test it. He stood alone one morning, waiting for 6:03, clutching an old audio recorder from the storage shed. When the crow arrived, he didn't move. When the beak opened, he held his breath. And the sound that filled the air, wet, breathless, broken, was one he had heard only once in his life. His father's last breath, rattling against hospital tubing, followed by that long, empty silence machines couldn't mask. The recording caught nothing. The crow closed its beak. The Cavero fell to his knees. There was no doubt anymore. This wasn't a trick. It wasn't a bird. Or maybe it was once. But now it was something else entirely. Something stitched together with remnants of grief, decay, unfinished endings. A sentinel made not of bone and instinct, but of memory. And as he stood again, trembling, he dared to look into its eyes. They were black, of course, but in their stillness, in the shape of the reflection cast there, he saw something staring back. Not the tomb, not the cemetery, but himself, standing alone, older, thinner, kneeling before that very grave, mourning something unnamed, or perhaps someone. He hadn't entered the archive room in years. The back office, built into the foundations of the old chapel, smelled of mildew and rotting paper. It was where records went to be forgotten. Burial ledgers, maintenance reports, yellowed receipts from decades of graves dug and closed. The Cavero brought a flashlight. The overhead light had long since failed, and he didn't trust the place to give him clarity, only fragments. But now he needed fragments, needed proof that the nameless grave was more than just a local oddity, more than just a stone that predated memory, more than a perch for something that wore the voice of the dead. He started with the ledgers from the 1950s. Nothing. The 40s. Nothing. By the time he reached the bottom shelf, he found what he hadn't even known he was looking for. A journal with a warped leather cover, unlabeled. The binding crumbled in his hands. Inside, each page was filled with names, dates, and plot numbers, handwritten in looping cursive, clearly compiled by an old caretaker. Most of the entries were mundane. Then he saw the row where the handwriting changed. Sharper, faster, a single line, unlike the rest. Burial denied, plot held, reason unclear, no name, no date, only a number etched in fading ink that matched the area of the grave watched by the crow. The page was smeared at the edges, like someone had wept over it, or bled. But there was more. Tucked inside, between the pages, was a smaller slip of brittle paper, folded thrice. A note. He unfolded it slowly, afraid it might dissolve in his hands. It read, in a slanted script barely legible under the yellowing of age, "He refused the earth, still watches from beneath." No signature, no context, But beneath the message, as if someone had scrawled it in a moment of panic, was a different ink, bolder and more frantic. He looks out through the bird. The Cavero stepped back, heart thudding like a drum against his ribs. The flashlight beam trembled. Something moved above, perhaps a rat in the rafters, but the sound felt heavier, intentional. He slammed the journal shut. The air felt wrong now. The office too small, the shadows too tall. He rushed out, the weight of the note burning in his pocket. When he returned to the grave, the crow was already there, perched silently, waiting. It didn't caw. It didn't flinch. But as the Cavero passed, he noticed something new etched into the back of the nameless headstone, barely visible in the granite's grain, as though drawn by fingertip rather than chisel. A perfect, unmistakable eye, staring outward. It hadn't been there before. The morning came heavy, draped in a pale fog that refused to burn off even as the sun climbed. The Cavero had slept little. He'd kept the journal beside him on the desk, the folded note under a weight of rusted tools, as though iron might contain whatever had slipped through those words. But he knew what he had to do. Some final confrontation had formed in his chest, quiet, cold, but firm. He walked the path to the grave slowly, as if approaching an old debt long ignored. It was 6:03 when he arrived, just as always. The crow was already there. But something had changed. The bird no longer paced the stone, no longer ruffled its wings or croaked its jagged cry when he drew near. It stood still, stiffer than usual, its eyes fixed on him, not with wariness, but awareness. That was the word that surfaced in his mind as he stepped closer. Awareness. As though the crow were waiting not just for a reaction, but for recognition. The Cavero stopped within a few feet. No scream, no flap of wings. Just the damp stillness and the faint ticking of something far away, like a clock underwater. He dropped to one knee, his fingers hovering over the stone. The carved surface still bore no name, no date, just that strange, almost imperceptible eye now etched into the back, like a hidden pupil, one that hadn't been there the day before, yet now pulsed faintly beneath his touch. Not light, not movement, but warmth. As if the stone remembered being alive. He placed his hand fully against it. That was when he heard it. Not with his ears, not exactly, but inside his head, like a voice speaking across great distance, a voice behind a door or deep beneath earth. It never opened because it never had to. The stone was always watching. He tried to speak, but his lips moved without sound, and then the vibration began, subtle at first, then stronger, not from beneath the ground, but from within his own chest, matching the pulse beneath the stone. He looked up. The crow was gone. Not flown, not fled, just not there. No rustle, no wind, no feather left behind, only the grave and his own breath. He stepped back, heart thudding in rhythms that no longer felt like his own. And then, from somewhere just outside his vision, came a whisper, not words, but the sound of a breath that had once belonged to someone else. A breath stolen from time. The Cavero turned, expecting a figure, a shadow, a face. There was none. But above, in the nearest tree, a shape took form. Another crow, or perhaps the same one. But this time, it wasn't watching the grave. It was watching him, and this time, he understood. The grave had waited not for someone to enter, but for someone to replace what had already climbed out. Story 6. The heat had pressed down on the town for 27 days straight. Not a drop of rain, not even the hope of a cloud in the blue-stained sky. Lawns turned the color of bone, dirt cracked into brittle puzzle pieces, and cicadas screamed in the trees like they were praying for death. But inside the cemetery, just past the rusted iron gate and under the reach of the leaning poplars, the ground was always damp. Not soaked, not flooded, just damp enough to glisten, just damp enough to smell like turned soil after a storm that no one remembered seeing. The grass there stayed green when the rest of the town crisped yellow. The crows pecked at the worms that somehow still surfaced each morning. And every time the groundskeeper made his rounds, he would step in with dry boots and leave with soles soaked and darkened. The strangest part was that it never seemed to touch him. He would look at his arms, his sleeves, his hat, bone dry. But the wheelbarrow was wet. The headstones were slick. The wooden crosses, even the ones bleached white with time, seemed to weep. Once, he leaned in close to a marble slab that always ran with moisture and smelled the stone. It reeked of salt, not the earthy musk of rain, but the sharpness of something older, something like sweat or tears. He touched the surface and felt a chill, though the sun above the chapel was blinding. He looked up, hand shading his eyes. Still no clouds, still no wind, still no reason. The chapel roof creaked under the weight of its age, but even there, moss glistened green. It was as though the cemetery had a weather of its own, a sky of its own, a calendar no one else followed. He asked the delivery man from town if it had rained the night before. The man laughed and said it hadn't rained in 3 weeks, not a single drop. But the groundskeeper had watched puddles gather beneath the stone angel near the eastern wall just last night, watched them ripple as if something had walked through them. He started noting it down in a little spiral notebook. Dates, temperatures, cloud conditions. Always the same. Dry outside, damp inside. He collected leaves from outside the gate, brittle and sun-scorched, and compared them to the ones that fell within the fence. Soft, pliant, still green at the stems. At first he thought it might be groundwater, a broken pipe. He dug a test hole near the center plot. It filled slowly with water while he was still digging, but there was no source. The water didn't bubble or flow. It just appeared, seeped from somewhere unseen. That night, he placed an old metal bucket beneath a leaning stone cross where the droplets always gathered on the tip. He wanted proof, wanted to hear the patter, but no sound came. In the morning, the bucket was full, but the earth beneath was untouched. That was the moment he stopped thinking in plumbing, in leaks, in explanations. That was the moment he started to listen. It was 3:11 a.m. when he woke to the sound, faint, patterned, impossible. The groundskeeper had long grown accustomed to the cemetery's nocturnal quiet, the rustle of windless leaves, the far-off hum of passing trucks on Route 8. But that night, what stirred him wasn't natural. It was rain, the kind of gentle, rhythmic patter that made roofs exhale and windows weep. Yet when he looked outside from his chapel window, the sky was a sheet of stars, pale and unmoving. He stepped outside, flashlight in hand, boots unlaced, and immediately felt the contrast. Dry breeze on his face, a slight humidity on the air, and yet drops falling everywhere but on him. He walked slowly, scanning the paths, the gravel crunching softly beneath his steps. The raindrops shimmered in the flashlight beam, but never landed on the lens. They shimmered around the statues, tracing their features like reverent fingers. Over the grave of Marjorie Whitehall, the droplets collected in tiny rivulets along the carved name. He crouched, touched a puddle forming on the flat stone base. It was cold, colder than the air, colder than his breath. He tried to find the source, looked up. No clouds. The trees didn't sway, and yet droplets clung to every leaf. They weren't falling from above. They were forming mid-air, pulling into being as if drawn from nothing. He stood still and listened harder. The rain had texture, tone. It changed as he moved. Some areas sounded like steady drizzle on tin, others like the slow drip of a faucet in a silent house. But then he passed by the grave of a child, Nora Lynn, aged 4, and the sound shifted. There it resembled weeping, faint and high, like sobs swallowed by stone. A few yards over by the stone slab of a soldier with no known kin, the rain sang instead, like breath caught in a throat before a scream. He stepped back in fear. The sounds were not made by impact, but as if the water itself held memories, replayed in loops for those willing to stand long enough to hear. That night, he walked the perimeter for hours, trying to find where it stopped. He marked the points along the walls, stuck wooden stakes where the rain began and ended. But when he returned the next day, the stakes were soaked through on both sides, and the boundary had shifted. It never stayed the same. Sometimes the chapel stood in the dry. Other times it dripped from every beam, the stained glass windows fogged with condensation. Once, he tried recording the sounds on an old tape recorder, rewound it the next day to listen. Static. Nothing. Not even his own breathing. The rain, it seemed, existed only for those willing to walk through it. He tried again the following night. this time standing perfectly still for over an hour near the southeastern path, where the puddles never formed. And there, beneath the branches of a tree he didn't remember planting, he heard it again. Not droplets, not mist, but words. A sentence formed in the quiet. "We're still thirsty." He turned. No one. But the tree was wet, and the soil beneath it was bleeding. He began to notice which headstones were always wet, not just damp, not just kissed by moisture, but saturated, darkened to near black, as if they had been submerged. While others dried within moments, these few always glistened, no matter the time of day. The rain didn't just fall on them, it sank in. One morning, just past 5, he knelt by one of the older markers. Amos Turner, died 1871, and laid his palm flat against the stone. It was cold, but not in a natural way. Not the chill of granite shaded by trees, but the kind of cold that crept into the joints, that held memory. And worse, it was pulsing. Not with light or warmth, but with something he could only describe as thirst. The stone was pulling the moisture inward, and something told him it was pulling more than just water. Over the course of several days, he took to watching these select graves. All were older. All belonged to people without visitors, no flowers, no offerings. And one by one, he began to see something deeply wrong. Letters were vanishing, names becoming incomplete. Amos Turner became Amos Tur, then Amos II, then just Amos. And still the water flowed. He thought perhaps it was erosion, years of wind and rain doing their work. But that didn't explain the others. Graves whose inscriptions had lasted a century, now faded within days. One night, he brought chalk to rub the names and preserve them. But by morning, the chalk had melted into the stone like sugar on a tongue. It wasn't erosion. The stones were swallowing them. Not just the letters, but the identity itself, the memory. He watched the grave of Eleanor Timms, whose headstone now bore only the dates, no name. He tried to remember her face from the photo once kept in the chapel's obituary drawer, but nothing came, not even a trace. Her name no longer triggered a single image, as though the water had erased not only her mark on stone but her place in time. That same night, he saw something new, a headstone further up the hill, blank, newer, smoother than the rest. He'd never seen it before, though he passed that row daily. It had no inscription, only a faint, wet shimmer, as if it had been crying. He pressed a hand against it, and this time it wasn't cold. It was warm, beating, like the side of a sleeping animal. He jerked back, heart stammering, and watched as droplets beaded along its face. Then a word began to appear, slowly, letter by letter, as if written from beneath the stone. His last name, not the full name, just the beginning, and it was still forming. He backed away and ran. But even in the chapel, the rain kept falling outside the windows, and inside, the silence now felt crowded. That night, he didn't sleep, not from fear, but because he knew something was being written, something that could only exist once someone else had been forgotten. He spent the next day combing through the chapel's storage, seeking anything, photographs, funeral records, obituaries that might anchor the names already fading from the stones. But every folder he opened was thinner than it should have been, pages missing, entries blacked out with smudged ink or simply torn clean. In one drawer near the base of the altar, rusted shut and long ignored, he found something unusual, a parish register from the late 1800s, bound in a warped leather spine, its latch sealed with what looked like melted wax and ash. When he touched it, the latch snapped apart on its own, and inside, the pages were surprisingly dry. All except one. Just one. Near the center, page 237, he found moisture. Thick droplets clung to the parchment like morning dew on glass, refusing to slide or soak through. He tapped it gently. The water stayed. He turned the chapel's desk lamp toward it. The rest of the book remained dry, but the ink on this single page had begun to dissolve, names melting into long, blurred strokes, dates curling inward like dead leaves. Only one name had not faded completely. Written and overwritten, as if trying to be removed but never quite forgotten, was a single entry. M. Harlan, a name he didn't recognize, but the initial matched his own. Scrawled in the page's margin was a note in cramped, uneven handwriting. The ones the rain remembers are the ones it wants back. As he stared, he noticed the droplets multiplying. The page began to drip, slowly at first, then faster. He looked down. The bottom of the drawer was dry. The water wasn't leaking downward. It was moving sideways, soaking into the wood of the desk. Toward him. Panicking, he slammed the book shut. But the moisture didn't stop. A trail now followed the desk legs to the floor, disappearing into the stonework like veins in a body. He tore the page out, folded it, and stuffed it into a tin box, locked it, buried it behind the chapel, beneath dry earth. By morning, the earth above it was damp, and inside the chapel, the drawer was wet again. The book had returned. Opened once more to page 237, the name still legible. This time, no ink. Just his initials, carved into the paper as though by fingernail. He didn't open it again. Not that night. Not since. But he did notice something else. In the stone floor beneath the altar, where water once never touched, a puddle had begun to grow. Shallow, perfectly round. And every time he passed, it shimmered, as if something were moving behind the reflection. Not his face, not the room, just rain, falling in a place not made for it. And within it, the faint shape of letters still being written. On the final night before handing over his post, the Caviro stepped into the cemetery with the quiet intention of saying goodbye, not to the graves, not to the soil, but to the weight he'd carried without fully knowing it. He'd spent 32 years walking that path, digging, marking, observing, recording, but never truly understanding what lingered between the names. The new keeper was set to arrive by morning. Everything had been prepared. Keys returned, logs signed, uniform folded on the chapel bench. He expected the night to be dry. The forecast called for nothing but wind and silence. And yet, the moment he passed through the iron gates, a drop touched his cheek. It wasn't the faint mist he'd grown used to seeing cling to stone and moss. It was deliberate, heavy, cold. It struck him not from above, but as though summoned directly into the space he occupied. He looked up. No clouds. Not even a breeze, just the vast, endless black sky. Another drop followed. Then another. They hit his shoulders, his brow, the back of his hand. Each time he blinked, the air shimmered around him as if refracted through a sheet of invisible rain. And yet, when he stepped back, beyond the threshold of the cemetery gate, the rain ceased. Bone dry, dust underfoot. But inside, the rainfall resumed. With a step forward, the air thickened. The drops intensified. Still, no one else was wet. The ground did not glisten. The gravestones remained ashen and dry. Only he was soaked. And when he looked down, something moved in the puddle forming at his feet. Not his reflection, but a name. Carved clean into the water's surface, etched with the clarity of stone. Michael Harlan, 1956-2024. The water rippled. His name trembled. Then, rising slowly from beneath the surface of the puddle, he saw his own face. Paler, older, eyes half closed. It looked back at him with no emotion, no recognition, just waiting. He stepped backward again, shaking, blinking. The reflection disappeared, but the wetness did not. His clothes clung to his skin. The cemetery lights, long since extinguished, flickered once, then dimmed. He turned toward the chapel, hoping to find shelter, but the building no longer cast a shadow. The stone glistened like wet glass, and a steady stream now poured down its walls, but not from above. The water emerged from within, dripping out of the stone as if the building itself were weeping. He turned around. Every grave he'd ever tended, hundreds of them, now had water beating down their names. Not just dampness, not illusion, full, living rain, pouring only where the dead lay, and only he stood among them. By morning, when the sun returned, the new keeper arrived to find the chapel door ajar, the keys resting on the bench, and no sign of Michael Harlan, only the faint sound of dripping, even in sunlight, and a puddle that wouldn't dry, right in the center of the cemetery path. Shallow, still, with a reflection that wasn't his own. Story 7. He had walked the chapel halls 1,000 times, long after the living had said their last goodbyes and the dead no longer needed an audience. The old wooden pews creaked with the memory of sermons past, and the stained glass windows caught no light anymore, only moon glow and dust. Harold Whitmore, 63, cemetery caretaker for over half his life, was used to silence. That night, however, silence didn't last. It began with a hum, faint, like air moving through copper pipes, and it came from the antique speaker bolted high in the northwest corner of the chapel. He turned his head instinctively, more annoyed than alarmed. The system had been cut off from the grid since the early 2000s. A storm had fried the circuits, and no one bothered to fix it. There was no power line left, no panel, no fuse to trip. It was dead, but the sound kept building, not louder, just more focused, as if something were squeezing itself through a place it didn't belong. Then a whisper, one name, just one, drawn out, like breath in cold air. Ellis Montgomery. Harold stood frozen, heart ticking like a slow metronome, until the voice faded into nothing, and the chapel went back to stillness. No breeze, no static, just him, the pews, and the dust. He tried to laugh it off, blamed the wind, the metal of the old speaker expanding from temperature drop. Anything but what it sounded like. But Ellis Montgomery was real. A man in his late 50s, ran the local auto repair, always left burnt coffee on the counter, and had a limp from a car accident in '92. That was Monday night. On Tuesday morning, Harold passed the corner store and saw the handwritten sign on the bulletin board. In loving memory of Ellis Montgomery, died suddenly in his sleep. The town said, heart failure. Harold said nothing. He remembered the voice, how calm it sounded, how sure. He told himself it was a coincidence. That's what he repeated on the second night when he walked past the chapel again. And the speaker gave off another hiss, another name, this one even more familiar. The second name came 2 nights later, though Harold had been waiting the very next one. He hadn't gone to bed at all, just sat in his office behind the chapel, pretending to go over maintenance logs he hadn't updated in months. He left the door open, let the air drift in, but nothing came. No sound, no whisper. Just the slow ticking of the broken wall clock that hadn't moved past 2:34 since 2011. So when the second voice came, clearer, softer, dragging across the empty air like fingers on satin, it caught him mid-breath. He didn't need to be in the chapel this time. The sound carried down the hall, through the old vents and wood beams, as though the building itself had been waiting to speak again. Marjorie Bell. The name sank into his gut like a swallowed stone. He stood up too quickly, knocking his chair back, and stared at the cracked ceiling tiles above the hallway. It had spoken to him. Only him. He stepped into the chapel again, flashlight dead in his palm, but the room looked the same. Pews in crooked lines, windows sagging with dust, the speaker a black shadow above the pulpit. He wrote the name down in his ledger, page 57, bottom margin, then waited. Marjorie Bell, the woman who ran the flower shop 3 blocks away and always brought wilting roses to her late husband's grave, died the following Monday, fell from her attic ladder, broke her neck. Her funeral was scheduled 2 days after. Harold watched them lower her into the ground, watched the priest recite words he barely heard. The dirt fell like rain on wood. That made 2. 2 names whispered into the silence. 2 deaths. He didn't tell anyone. Not the new groundskeeper in training. Not the priest. Not the young widow who came each morning to weep beside her father's stone. No one would believe him. They didn't hear it. That's what mattered. When he tested it, just to be sure, he brought a voice recorder the next time, placed it directly beneath the speaker, and pressed record. That night, at exactly 2:57 a.m., the voice returned. Luther Paxton. It filled the space again like breath. He heard it as clear as he had the first 2 times. But in the morning, when he played the tape back, there was nothing. Just the sound of his own footsteps retreating. Not even static. The recorder captured only silence, as if the chapel had swallowed the truth the moment he turned it on. Luther Paxton was the town's only dentist. 61. Died of a stroke. Alone. No children. The obituary ran in the paper 4 days later. Harold stopped using the recorder. He stopped trying to prove anything. Because now, each night, he could feel the chapel before he even reached it. It breathed. It waited. And the voice always returned. Always between 2 and 3 in the morning. Always one name. Just one. always someone he knew. He started sleeping less, watching more, writing every name. Some he didn't know, some he remembered from childhood. Some still walked by his gate during the day, but they wouldn't for long, because 1 week after the whisper, the ground opened and someone new moved into the earth. He couldn't sleep after the 6th name, not even in fragments. Every time he closed his eyes, the voice returned, not from memory, but as if it hovered just behind his eardrum, waiting to say more. It was never louder, never clearer, just persistent. He began to wonder if the chapel had always spoken like this, if its voice had just gone unheard for lack of someone willing to listen. One morning, after burying a boy whose name had echoed through the chapel 7 days before, Harold did something he hadn't done in 20 years. He climbed into the chapel's attic. The stairs groaned like wounded ribs beneath him, and the air smelled of dried flowers and thyme. Up there, beneath layers of insulation and forgotten hymn books, lay the rusted frame of the old PA system, the source of the whisper. It was the same one he remembered installing in the 80s, when the chapel had still seen weekly services. But the back was different now. Where wires had once coiled neatly into wall sockets and circuit boxes, now there was only one. A single, black wire, aged but intact, trailing from the base of the speaker like a vein. It slithered out through a crack in the floorboards, down through the chapel walls, and into the earth. He followed it. It took him through the rear corridor, past the tool shed, across the gravel path, and toward the east border of the cemetery, where the graves became older and the ground less even. He walked past dates carved before the town had electricity, before it had a name. The wire stayed just beneath the surface, sometimes visible through cracks in the dirt, sometimes hidden beneath moss and roots, but it never changed direction. And then it stopped, right at the base of a grave with no headstone. There was a plot marker, one of the old wrought iron ones, the kind they hadn't used since the 1920s. But it bore no name, no date, no family, just a rusted spike in the earth, leaning slightly as if tired of holding a secret. Harold crouched beside it, brushed the dirt away from where the wire disappeared beneath the soil. No junction, no power source, no battery, just wire, disappearing into a place where nothing should connect. He tried to photograph it. His phone froze. The screen turned black. He snapped pictures with an old camera instead. When developed, the frame showed everything but the grave. The wire ended in midair, against an empty background. He brought in a technician, someone from out of town, someone who didn't know the history. The man traced the wire, examined the chapel, declared it a prank, some leftover installation from a forgotten system. "This thing isn't drawing any power," he muttered, "but it's still warm." The technician didn't stay for coffee. He left before sundown, and the next night, at 2:59 a.m., the chapel whispered again. The name, Elliot Gresham. Harold didn't recognize it, not until he checked the service ticket still clipped to the bulletin board. That was the technician's name. The wire hadn't just connected to the chapel, it connected to something else, something beneath, and now it had claimed someone new. When Harold returned to the grave with the iron spike, he found something waiting for him, a fresh patch of disturbed soil. No flowers, no ceremony, just a quiet mound. The wire was gone, as if it had retracted into the earth. Satisfied, he began to hear it before it was real. Not the whisper itself, but the thought of it, like a memory planted backward. On a damp Tuesday morning, he woke with a single name echoing in his head, as if it had been spoken in a dream he couldn't recall. Marion Everett. It meant nothing to him at first. The name sat at the edge of recognition, like an actor from a movie you half remember. He carried it in his chest all day like a tight knot, waiting. That night, at precisely 2:58, he walked into the chapel before the system could stir. He sat beneath the speaker and waited, unmoving. The floorboards didn't creak. The air didn't shift. And yet, the moment the clock turned 3 hours, the system came alive, not with static, but with breath. The same inhale before speech. Then, Marion Everett. It wasn't confirmation. It was alignment. He hadn't predicted the name. The chapel had placed it inside him. It was choosing, using him. 2 days later, the name appeared in the obituaries. Natural causes, an aneurysm. She died in her sleep, alone, quiet. The paper said she had no family, no visitors, no known past. But Harold remembered her. 5th grade teacher. Nervous laugh. She taught him how to spell cemetery without an A. The memory came crashing in like a wave breaking through a dam. He hadn't thought of her in decades, hadn't seen her face in just as long, and yet, somehow, the voice had pulled the name from the deepest vault of his mind, wiped off the dust, and placed it back into the world just long enough to bury it. He stopped sleeping after that. He began to dread the dreams, the flickers of names before they formed. When the voice came, he already knew what it would say. One night, he whispered it before the speaker did. Alan Richter, a man from the Rotary Club, someone who used to bring his dog to the cemetery before it was fenced. That week, Alan drowned. Alone, fishing in the reservoir, no one around for miles. They found him with water in his lungs and his dog howling at the bank. Another name that hadn't just been announced. It had been offered. It wasn't prophecy. It was influence, suggestion, a slow erosion of will. By the 4th name, Harold started writing them down as soon as he dreamed them, circling the ones that later came true. Every single one. The voice was using him like a tuning fork. The sound would land in him, rattle through his bones, and emerge again as fate. The worst part wasn't the inevitability. It was the delay, the cruel rhythm of knowing and waiting, the sound of the earth digging itself 1 week too early. Then, one night, the name came early, not during sleep, not through the speaker, but while Harold stood alone in the chapel, wide awake. It whispered without breath, without machinery, just sound humming against the glass of the stained window behind him. Lillian Hart. It hit him like a memory, but not his. Someone else's grief, someone else's loss. He rushed to his old address book, flipped pages until the name appeared. The woman who ran the flower shop. She hadn't spoken to him in years, had barely remembered his name when he ordered a wreath. The next day, she collapsed at work. Aneurysm again. Just like Marion. He didn't wait for the obituary this time. He knew it would appear. What chilled him wasn't the pattern, it was the speed. The space between whisper and death was narrowing, as if the voice no longer needed the delay, as if it was practicing, becoming more precise. And Harold was becoming more involved. A vessel, maybe, or worse, an accomplice. That night, there was nothing. No whisper, no breath behind the speaker. No dream with a name carved into it before he could resist. Just the ticking of the wall clock and the sound of his own lungs, pulling in stale air like someone preparing for a last dive. Harold waited beneath the chapel's dusty rafters, eyes locked on the speaker. He counted each second. At 3 a.m., nothing happened, not even static. The silence itself was a message. It felt heavy, purposeful, like the pause between thunder and lightning. It stretched so long that Harold began to believe it was over, that maybe he'd broken the loop by expecting it, by knowing too much. But then, at 3:17, it came. Not a whisper, a sob. It was drawn out and wet and wrong, something raw and sick with grief. Then a pause, and then his name, not just spoken but drawn out, syllable by syllable, as if the voice behind it was savoring the weight of each letter. Harold M. Keeclane. It didn't sound mechanical this time. It didn't sound like a recording or a malfunction. It sounded like someone speaking from just behind the wall, pressing their mouth against the hollow cavity of the system. He felt it vibrate through the floorboards. It made his teeth ache. He didn't scream. He didn't run. He simply stood, because he already knew what came next. At dawn, he walked through the cemetery with the quiet reverence of someone attending his own funeral. The birds did not sing. The air was too still. And near the northern edge, where the grass always grew too fast, he found it. A new plot. Unmarked. Freshly turned. No tombstone yet, but a wooden stake hammered into the soil. A small placard hung from it, burned at the edges. The name carved in it by hand, crooked and deep. His. And the date etched beneath it wasn't a week ahead. It was that day. He didn't know what scared him more, the finality of it, or the calm that followed. Because in that moment, everything went quiet. The air lifted. The sky opened. Even the weight on his chest evaporated, as if something had been waiting to be fulfilled. and now it was. He walked back to the chapel. The speaker was cold to the touch. The cable that ran from it had disintegrated into strands of ash. The clipboard where he'd been writing names had vanished. The logbook was blank. Every trace of the transmissions gone. That afternoon, he sat alone in the pew, staring at the altar as the sunlight pushed through the cracked, stained glass. And then, from the corner of his vision, he saw someone entering through the side gate. A man in his 60s, looking confused, carrying a clipboard and wearing the same badge Harold had once worn. A new groundskeeper. Harold smiled, just faintly, and stood. He knew the speaker would whisper again. But next time, it wouldn't whisper to him. It would whisper through him. Because systems like these, they never really shut off. They just wait for a new voice.